Video games have always been an interesting medium for the many elements that it borrows from other artistic mediums that allows it to exist in its current form. Despite this, it is arguably the best medium for immersion and player interactivity, because the player is able to engage with the world within the art. In addition, players are also granted the freedom of expression, as it allows them to act freely within the game's limits, which results in unique experiences for every playthrough. This might be a straightforward argument for anyone who has played video games on game consoles, computers, mobile devices, arcade cabinets, or I guess a refrigerator or a calculator if you prefer. But even if you're a person who doesn't regularly play games or maybe knows more about film than video games, and by the way, this video would be for you film students in the class I'm presenting this to, I'm definitely sure you'd be familiar with the classics or popular games, as these recently had adaptations as film or show. And more specifically, Mario, The Last of Us, Sonic the Hedgehog, League of Legends, and many more. However, out of all these spectacular games, this isn't what this video is about. You see, there is a video game series by a certain game company that you may or may not have heard of. It has been considered as a pioneer of the PC gaming community and shifted the entire gaming industry. The game's revolutionary interpretation of combining the best attributes of player interaction, narrative elements, and world building were only a part of its legacy. In fact, it's best known for its community involving game modification around that game and the company's future games, and that game was Valve's Half-Life. Okay, so let's take a quick rundown for the folks who don't know about Valve or Half-Life. Valve was founded in 1996 by Mike Harrington and Gabe Newell, who were both ex-Microsoft developers by the time they formed their company. They would receive the source code of ID Software's Quake, which was a first-person shooter game that evolved from Doom, with its new 3D graphics technology that was the biggest tech achievement for its time. This became the foundation of Valve's first game engine, Gold Source, as it was heavily modified to fit their needs for their first game. The company would also gather team members of people who were originally part of the game development industry or were young developers who happened to have experience creating modifications of Quake. Valve would eventually ship the preview copy of Half-Life Day 1 OEM demo, which would unfortunately get leaked very early to the public. In the perspective of the developers, they were livid that the game was revealed too early, but they were pleasantly surprised to see very positive feedback from those who got their hands on that copy, especially from gaming news outlets. It was praised highly because it pushed the limits of what video games were capable of as a complex narrative medium. The sequences in game were fully interactable to where the player's control wasn't taken away from them during cutscenes or dialogue, and the world building was able to speak for the story itself. Gabe Newell even acknowledges that many of the player's actions and choices must be reflected back to the player in game, which was implemented in the game's many details, technologies, and AI systems. Finally, after struggling to find footing in the game they wanted to make, Valve officially released Half-Life to the world on November 19th, 1998, and it shook the gaming industry by storm. As a consequence, the interest in modifying video games skyrocketed because the Gold Source engine was intentionally developed for the ease of use. Many of the game's players would actually develop custom content themselves for the game. Such a coincidence that Half-Life itself began as a modification of Quake, and even with a few members of the development team, started off modifying Quake originally before working with Valve. Of course, the modding community had always existed since the days of Doom and Quake, but at some point, it fell into dormancy from the lack of new ideas that didn't separate from those games' identity. Only until the release of Half-Life in its Gold Source engine did it flourish again, because not only was it easy to use and modify, but it was also the new wave of game design that was inspired by how these creative concepts were presented. It allowed its modding developers to create new and exciting ideas that frequently took the form of replacing assets and building entire maps with unique set pieces. In some instances, there have been fully developed games that also modified the Gold Source engine to create fundamentally different games that could be set apart from their predecessor. Most of these games still have presence today and have only grown larger in popularity since. In fact, Valve themselves even bought the rights to those games and hired the development teams behind them because of their great potential. By the time it was 2004, Valve would release Half-Life 2 with the introduction of their new Source engine. Its existence was built off of their previous iteration and featured new technology like proper physics in almost everything that you can interact with in-game, and new graphical capabilities. The game design was also improved from the first game, as the developers had more experience and knowledge from the previous games. One of the prime examples was to set up a scenario within the world that helped players learn new game mechanics while giving them the space to experiment with their newfound knowledge, something that was totally encouraged by the developers. As for the modding community, the Source engine would garner a large presence as a medium for game modifications. The practice of changing or adding assets into an existing game was still just as present. However, the engine's new technology and ideas only multiplied the number of mods and games, with content that was either original, expanded upon official content, or faithfully recreated. All of which were only held back by its technical limitations, something that we wouldn't be seeing until the present day. Examples such as the self-aware choose-your-own-adventure narrative game, Stanley Parable, or a sandbox game that was fueled by community content, Garry's Mod, or the remake of Valve's first game, Black Mesa, or the fast-paced sci-fi shooter with rideable mech robots, Titanfall. The community also enhanced the multiplayer aspect of Valve's games by creating whole new variations of game modes that used those games as a foundation. At some point in time, Valve utilized their storefront as a platform for streamlining community content into any game that supported modding if the developer chooses to. It allows that content to be publicly available, easily accessible to users, and has plenty of quality of life features that make the process very simple to manage. Obviously, this applied to their official games too, but instead, the community creators benefited from having their creations chosen by Valve and officially added into those games with the bonus of earning revenue from it. This was Valve's method of encouraging players to create content for the community within a controlled environment. Although some creators and users didn't like that modified content was under a big company like Valve, and preferred to host their creations in third-party websites and community forums, which was the original way that people shared this kind of content. The only downside was not knowing what you were getting out of those downloads, and some websites were just not moderated entirely. This form of content sharing still exists today, and isn't under the control of Valve, but it really depends on where the creators wanted to display their content. Despite this, both methods have been largely successful in showcasing the wide plethora of custom content made by players who have a ton of passion for their respective game and their craft, while being mostly free to access and play. In some rare occasions, this led to some of those amateur developers to find themselves actually working for the game development industry. Now that we've reached the present day, the modding community has basically branched out to other game mediums where you'd see small to large-scale modifications of existing games. In some instances, small developers would actually create indie games that put a twist on an existing concept, as the industry has never been more accessible than today. But the Gold Source and Source Engine modifications were always on a different level with modded content because of its legacy. You will still find people creating new content and fun activities with Valve's games, but I wouldn't be surprised to see new content showing up for the next few years in Valve's newest game engine iteration, Source 2, which also featured even more technology just like its predecessors. It is already present in a few of their games so far, and even went as far as to update the 20-plus-year-old tools to be more ergonomic and user-friendly, something that I have gotten my hands on over the past few months to recreate already existing maps from the community with my own vision, including an original one like you're seeing here. But that's just how the process is in the modding community, or at least for any artistic medium in general. It's more or less the concept of building on top of existing ideas to form something new, or to be expanded upon, just like art.